Welcome to the first Aussie History podcast for the unit on the changing nature of warfare. In this podcast we're going to focus on what changed in recruitment and in the training of soldiers from the year 50 AD during the Roman occupation of Britain all the way up to the present day army. Every podcast in this series will have some sort of focus on change. Even the podcasts on individual battles will include some information on how things changed, because after all, this is the point of this unit in your exam. The exam board wants to see who can understand change, who can see the complexities of judging whether something has changed or continued along similar lines, and for the very top students they'll want to see you demonstrate your understanding of just how far things changed. Very rarely is it sufficient to say everything changed entirely or everything stayed completely the same. With that in mind, the phrases to some extent and to a large extent and similar sort of phrases might be good phrases to use in this exam. And so, to the podcast. Recruitment into the Roman army was a huge commitment. A legionary, which is the name given to your average Roman soldier, though there are other terms for different roles, would have to commit to the Roman army for a total of 20 years. The Roman army had many advantages over the enemies it fought, which allowed the Romans to build one of the largest empires the world has ever seen. One of the benefits was this 20-year term of service. It gave them an advantage, because the barbarian hordes, well, they often fought, or only fought, when they were required to, and spent the rest of their time farming or hunting. The Roman army, on the other hand, had professional soldiers who could dedicate their lives to fighting, and they got rather good at it through the continuous training. This 20-year commitment also helped with the organisation of the Roman army, but that's for another podcast. At the recruitment stage, the Romans would select their recruits carefully and actually had medicals for potential recruits, something which was far ahead of its times. We're talking centuries here. Men went through examinations of their intelligence, their eyesight, and their height. All aspects of army recruitment in the British Army of the 20th century, or even the British Army right now, in the 21st century. Once the Romans had selected their soldiers, they would spend their time preparing the soldiers for real fighting through various techniques. One such technique was to have them fight battles against gladiators. You have to remember that a gladiator is basically anybody who is a slave that is forced to fight. So this doesn't mean the Roman army was in the Colosseum shouting, "Are you not entertained?" It just means they forced slaves to fight for them. The slaves weren't very organised or well trained, but they did have weapons, and this is not too dissimilar to the enemies that the Romans actually had to fight, because the barbarian hordes weren't very well organised or well trained, but they did have weapons, and they were fighting for their lives. So the Romans had good ways of practicing. The Romans had specialist training centres. Ooh! And they even had artillery ranges, so they could practice firing their specialist weapons. In addition, to help with training, all Roman weapons were built to a standard in special factories, so that no matter where they were or whose sword they picked up, they would be trained to use it. Because in other armies later than this period, all swords were different, they were balanced differently, and so it might not be as easy to fight with that particular weapon. Not in the Roman army though, everything was standardised. And this is why many historians will tell you that the Roman army were far ahead of their time in training and recruitment. The Romans also allowed men from countries that they had already conquered to join their army. These were known as auxiliaries, and if they agreed to fight for a long period of service of between 25 to 30 years, then at the end of that time, if they were still alive, they and their families would gain citizenship as Romans. The auxiliaries would be trained in just the same way as the Roman legionnaires, but it was a really good way of recruiting, because becoming a Roman citizen was a goal worth fighting for. At this time, the Romans' main enemy on the British Isles are now referred to as the Celts. But in reality, what they were a set of different tribes. In contrast to the Romans, the Celts had no professional army, they didn't have any training, or any training that they did have in warfare, came from just carrying out raids on neighbouring tribes. The soldiers fought with their own weapons, which were often basic. Sometimes they were even farming tools. And the outcome of this was that the Roman army was able to beat armies of vastly superior size, as you will find out in the podcast on Boudicca's revolt. If we fast forward 1,000 years to 1066 and past the Dark Ages to the time of Saxon England, we need to consider both the training and recruitment in armies of the Saxons and the army of the Normans, who were to clash at the Battle of Hastings. The Saxon armies of Britain were a little more advanced than their Celtic relatives of 10 centuries previous, because they did have within them small bodies of professional soldiers known as housecarls, although you might prefer to know them as housecarls because that's what it looks like, but I'm told that it would be pronounced housecarls. These housecarls would serve as bodyguards to earls, thanes, or the king for most of the time, but in wartime they would be the elite of the Saxon army. So they'd be bodyguards sometimes, but when the time came, they'd be right there in the middle. They would be trained from a young age, and only the strongest young boys would be chosen. So there was, I suppose, some sort of recruitment criteria, a bit like the Roman army, but it was more like, this boy looks strong, let's have him, rather than the more standardised medicals that the Romans forced their soldiers through. However, they differed from the Roman army because whereas all of the Roman army was professional, only a small proportion of the Saxon army was professional. The majority of the army was made up of peasant farmers, just like the Celtic armies had been, and this aspect of the Saxon army, only called up in times of emergency, was known as the Fyrd, F-Y-R-D. So the Saxon army had the housecarls and the Fyrd. The Fyrd had little or no training in warfare. Interesting fact! Contemporaries, which is what you call somebody who was writing at the time, write about the incredible strength of the housecarls, which were said to have been so strong that they could shear right through the neck of a horse in one single blow with their double-handed axes. The Viking leader Harald Hardrada is reported as having said that a housecarl was worth any 2 Viking warriors. Such a shame for the Saxons that they only had a few of these fearsome housecarl warriors. The Norman army was fairly similar to the Saxon army in many respects, but there are some important differences in their levels of training. Firstly, the Norman dukedom, Normandy wasn't a country ruled by a king, it was a dukedom ruled by a duke, was surrounded by enemies on all sides, and therefore the Normans fought a great many wars, so their troops were more battle-hardened than the Saxons. Secondly, the Saxon armies did not make much use of cavalry or archers. Cavalry, of course, being soldiers on horseback. But the Norman army did make great use of cavalry. Interesting point! The Saxon army had once used cavalry when a Norman baron was brought to live in Britain by the Saxon king Edward the Confessor, who, through marriage, well, this Norman who came across was Edward's nephew. The Norman baron was known as Ralph of Mance, and he fought like a Norman would, on horseback. However, in 1057 he fought the Welsh, who didn't use cavalry, and Ralph of Mance lost. This earned Ralph a nasty nickname of Ralph the Timid, but it also meant that the Saxons regarded cavalry as unimportant for an army. The wealthy earls and thanes in a Saxon army, and presumably many of the housecarls, would actually ride to battle on a horse and then get off to fight. Ralph of Mance, or Ralph the Timid, he has a lot to answer for the Saxon army. The Norman army's third biggest difference was that they used a greater proportion of professional soldiers. They still had peasant soldiers, like the Saxon Fyrd, although Fyrd is a Saxon word, so don't ever write about the Norman Fyrd, because they didn't use that word. But the Normans also used mercenaries. A mercenary is a professional soldier who is paid to fight, but he will fight for whoever employs him. So when William of Normandy invaded England, He brought with him an army of cavalry, archers, mercenaries from all different countries in Europe, and any peasants who owed military service. Obviously, a mercenary, whilst not necessarily militarily trained, would usually be a very good fighter because they did it for a living, and those that weren't very good would already be dead. However, mercenaries didn't drill and train as a team to the extent that the Romans or later armies did. Now, recruitment to a Norman and a Saxon army was very similar, because there was an organisation of land, which meant that people down the chain owed military service to those above them. You get some land, and in return, if there's a fight, you owe military service to the people who gave you the land. So the king gave land to his earls in England, or the duke gave land to his barons in Normandy. Roughly the same things, but different words due to the different languages. In return, the king would be owed taxes and military service, or the duke would be owed taxes and military service. The earls, or the barons, well, the earls gave land to the thanes in England, and the barons gave land to the knights in Normandy. And the thanes or knights owed the earls or barons taxes and military service, and the chain continued to the peasants. So in England it goes king, earls, thanes, peasants, and everybody owes military service up the chain. In Normandy it goes duke, barons, knights, peasants, and everybody owes military service up the chain. People were not really recruited into the army so much as they owed service. There is, of course, the exception of the housecarls, who were paid for by the Saxons, and, of course, the exception of the mercenaries, who were paid for by the Normans. After the Normans won the Battle of Hastings, we enter a period of history known as the medieval period. Much of this time, the English army was very similar to the Norman or Saxon armies. Men were mostly recruited because they owed military service, but there were some knights who were wealthy barons in suits of armour with huge war horses, and they sometimes employed men-at-arms, which I suppose were a bit like housecarls of the Saxon army. But that's only a small portion. Most of them owed military service. Like the Norman army, the medieval English army used archers. Just like the Saxon army, however, the medieval army was, as I've said, made up mostly of peasants. Some medieval armies used mercenaries too, like the Normans had done, and mercenaries did become increasingly popular as the medieval period wore on. A very important development for you to know for your exams is the, 1181 AD or 1181 Asses of Arms. And yes, it does sound like a naughty word for bottoms, so that hopefully will help you to remember it. 1181 Asses of Arms, passed by Henry II, which said that anybody who owned property had to provide their own weapons and fight for the king in times of need. This increased the size of medieval armies because then it suddenly incorporated everybody who owned any property. As for training, well, this did improve a bit. Knights, as books and films would suggest, were exceptionally well trained, with tournaments, jousting competitions, and the fact that they began training at about the age of 11 as a page, graduating then to become a squire, and finally made it as a knight. The peasants, which of course made up most of the army, didn't train so much, but unlike the Saxon army, there were laws passed to make sure that peasants practiced archery. That was pretty much the extent of their training, though. So, if we were to summarise, from 50 AD to 1350, the Roman army was exceptionally well trained. The recruitment process was careful and deliberate, but the Celts, Saxons, Norman and medieval armies were behind the Roman army in how far developed their recruitment and training was, even though the medieval armies came well over 1,000 years after the Romans. Generally speaking, the majority of the Celtic, Saxon, Norman and medieval armies were not well trained, and recruitment was based on what people owed rather than selecting people for their suitability to fight, with the exception of knights. Now the exam board requires us to look at the period 1350 to 1700, which begins with the late medieval period, runs through the Tudor and Stuart period and into the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. The biggest change in recruitment during this time came as a result of the 100 Years' War, which England fought with France. Interesting fact, the 100 Years' War lasted for 116 years, between 1337 and 1453. It was not actually one continuous war, but a series of wars between England and France. So I would assume historians have called it the 100 Years' War just to confuse the heck out of any students of history. In this 100 Years' War, the old system, which we've talked about already, of owing military service, was shown to be totally inadequate, as much of the war was fought on French soil. So some people who owed military service claimed that this did not extend to fighting abroad. In addition, as we know, feudal armies were not well trained, and not always committed to the cause, as they were being sort of forced into fighting, or you could say pressed into fighting. And the armies, the feudal armies, were also fairly small, made up mostly of peasants. So the biggest change in recruitment in the late medieval period after 1350 was that those commanding armies were far more likely to employ mercenaries, which were very expensive and resulted in war becoming an even more expensive thing to do than it already was, and it already was very expensive. So what kings did to deal with that is raised higher taxes. Mercenaries would be paid more money if they were a more valuable type of soldier. So the contract between a mercenary and their employer was called an indenture. There's a key word for you to use in your exams. Indenture. So, for example, a normal foot soldier would gain 2 pence per day, whereas an archer would gain 3 pence per day. And a mounted knight could gain 1 whole shilling, which was a lot of money in those days. Interesting fact! A knight who did not fight for a particular baron or king could hire out his services as a mercenary, and this was known as being a freelance knight, because his lance was free to be bought, because he wasn't tied down by feudal service. Freelance is still the term we use today for people who work for themselves and are hired by companies as and when needed. As for training, well, things were similar to the early medieval period, whereby the knights were trained extremely well, and mercenaries spent most of their lives fighting, so they were fairly capable, or they were dead. Some mercenary captains trained their bands of men, but there was no strict requirement for this. There was one extremely significant development in the period from 1350 in terms of training, and that was in the training of longbowmen. We already mentioned how in 1181 the Assize of Arms was passed, meaning people had to fight for the king in times of need if they owned property. Well, they passed another Assize of Arms in 1252, which said that every single one, all English men aged 15 to 60 had to own a bow by law. If I'd have been given a bow aged 15, then I most certainly would have been out using it. I mean, I imagine if somebody gave you a bow and arrow when many of you are 15 perhaps, or just turned over 15 into 16, and if they gave you a bow and arrow, you wouldn't just put it on the mantelpiece, you'd probably use it. And so, this is probably what happened. People, just by owning bows, practice with them for fun. But probably not everyone. Which is likely why Edward III ordered that all Englishmen had to practice archery on Sundays and on any holidays. This was all great. But the biggest change in the early medieval period was that people began to train in groups. So the archers drilled to improve accuracy and to improve their ability to coordinate their fire, so that they fired as a group and so that they could literally rain down arrows on their enemy. They would form into 10 lines of between 20 and 100 archers, and firing together, they would have a centenor, not a half man, half horse, different word, a centenor, who would give the command to loose arrows. But the centenor would only give that order when commanded to by it's a fancy title, this Master of Archers, who was usually a knight that was in charge of all of the archers on the battlefield and had become so skilled in the longbow that they'd managed to rise to this title of Master of Archers. To train, they'd put white sheets on the ground, and the whole group would practice putting their arrows onto the sheet, which was called clout shooting. So the archer units in English armies became very much coordinated. And if you listen to the podcast on Agincourt, 1415, in which a heavily outnumbered English army beat the French, you'll see that this improvement in the training of archers had a significant positive impact on the ability of the English army to fight. We were known through the world as having fearsome archers. The French hated our archers, and they'd got so deadly and so good, perhaps because of these asses of arms and these changes into training and clout shooting. In the Middle Ages, which for the purpose of the exam we will call the period 1450 to 1700, there came a development which threw some traditions in recruitment and particularly training right out the window, and that was the arrival of gunpowder in Europe from China, where it was invented. Cannon, muskets, new roles for infantry and other aspects of warfare changed, and therefore, with specialist new weapons, the importance of training increased. The biggest development was surely the new model army of the English Civil War, which was not a group of very good-looking men. It's nothing to do with models. In the Middle Ages, some troops were still provided through feudal duty, which that, military service thing we've mentioned. But because of the need for expensive new gunpowder weapons, this was becoming less useful, having feudal duty. The peasants who in feudal service turned up to battle with bows or swords and couldn't afford the gunpowder weapons. At the same time, the economy of Britain and Europe was improving, and so the kings were able to gain more money through tax. The upshot of this was that there was an ever greater swing towards mercenaries, paying people to fight for you, as we've already discussed. But during the English Civil War, 1642 to 49, the parliamentarians, who were fighting then against the royalists, it was parliamentarians v royalists, well, the parliamentarians developed a new army around about 1645, so 3 years into the war, which was filled with professional soldiers who were part of a standing army. Key point. A standing army is an army that doesn't have any chairs. I'm only kidding. It's an army that is always employed even when there is no war. Our modern army is a standing army, but feudal armies were only called up in times of need. It had nothing to do with chairs. The new model army had 22,000 troops and was paid for by the government through taxes. This was impressive by the standards of the time, and soldiers who had been called up, just like feudal armies and volunteers, would also fight in the parliamentarian armies, those who owed military service, but there was always a corps of 22,000 troops that could be called to fight at any time and were very well trained. If we look back, because remember this unit's all about comparisons, we'll see that at the Battle of Agincourt, the English army was made up of just 8,000 men, whereas the parliamentarian force fighting at Naseby was 26,000 strong, with large elements coming from the new model army, though there were still those who owed military service and some mercenaries. A new development was that the soldiers in the new model army were paid 8 pence per day instead of doing their feudal duty, and they were paid this all year round instead of just when fighting occurred, as with mercenaries. The new model army had a drill book, which was, it's nothing to do with tools either. It was extremely strict, but instilled discipline among the troops, and they were able to march, manoeuvre, and fight more efficiently. For example, they'd be better at firing and loading muskets quicker than other armies. So the drill book is like you drill things, you get it down to a T, you keep drilling it, you keep doing it. Anybody who gambled, drank, pillaged, or anywhere that had been conquered, or did anything like raping women or stealing things, the sorts of things which armies did, well, they'd be punished by death. Anybody who ran from battle would also be punished by death. Mercenaries were often little more than professional thugs, who worked for whoever they liked, when they liked, and for however long they liked. In contrast, once the new model army had signed up, or the soldiers in the new model army had signed up for the benefits of a regular wage. In return, they had to do everything that was commanded of them, with the result that the new model army was better trained, more disciplined, and generally more effective on the battlefield than the largely mercenary armies that came before, and the feudal armies that came before that. The discipline of the new model army helped the parliamentarians win at the Battle of Naseby, as you will hear on the Naseby podcast. And so on to warfare from the 18th century to the end of the 19th century. This was the age in which gunpowder really took over the battlefield. The first change in recruitment was that there was more of it in the early 1700s, and the size of the standing army of Britain grew to 50,000 men. But they did still rely on mercenaries during wartime. For example, in the War of Spanish Succession, the British Army rose to 150,000 troops, but 80,000 of them were mercenaries, and therefore less than half of the army was made up of regular soldiers from the standing army. But the standing army had risen to 70,000 men, which is far larger than the new model army of the Civil War, which we've just talked about. Recruitment also changed in how they went about recruiting people. Officers that commanded the units were selected from noble families, who paid for their sons to be able to join the army. These payments were called commissions. A commission cost more the higher the rank you were paying for, so only the very wealthiest families could afford to pay for their sons to receive the top positions. The lower ranks were offered a term of service of between 8 and 12 years, but once they signed up, they were expected to stay. The benefits at a time when life was tough for these lower ranks was that they got regular meals, and if they opted to sign up for life, they would even receive a lump sum of £20, which was a huge amount in the 1700s. Interesting fact! The National Archives suggest that £1 in 1750 would be worth £85 today, so £20 would have been over £1,700. The benefit of all this was that the British Army became better trained, as there was a larger standing army. But the downside was that the officers weren't necessarily very good, though they were almost exclusively very posh, as they had enough money to buy a commission. Training took the form of drilling, which meant that drilled soldiers had to do the same thing over and over and over and over again until it became second nature on the battlefield. For example, soldiers were taught to march at precisely 75 steps in a minute. It isn't easy. They were drilled to fire their guns in ranks, which meant firing, then going to the back of the line and reloading. The next line would then fire and return to the back, which meant a continuous rate of fire could be achieved. Woolwich Engineering and Military Academy, probably a bit different to Ossett Academy, was opened in 1741, and so some officers were educated in warfare. But actually most didn't bother to go and learned on the job instead, as there was no requirement for them to attend Woolwich Engineering and Military Academy. So the armies of the 1700s were drilled, but the officers weren't selected on ability, but on money. And also the men in the lower ranks tended to be men with no better prospects, because the army life was very, very tough. For example, they offered men a way out of prison if they joined the army. So army discipline had to be very harsh to keep the lower ranks controlled. But that's for another podcast. However, this well-drilled and disciplined force was to prove very useful to Wellington at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, because he was able to organise his troops to devastating effect. From 1793 to 1815, Britain and Europe was embroiled in wars with the French. Firstly, the French Revolutionary Wars, and then the Napoleonic Wars. A big development here was that the cost and the size of the armies being recruited increased massively. The British Army rose to contain 250,000 men by 1813, having had just 40,000 when the war began in 1793. This meant that more officers were needed, so the British allowed more promotion through the ranks based on ability, without the need to have to pay a commission. This made it so that people who bought a commission also had to serve a number of years before assuming their position. For example, a major, which is a high rank in the army, had to serve 6 years in addition to paying the commission. And if you're to go a bit less down the order, you've got a captain. Well, he had to serve for 2 years before he could become a captain. So Wellington's army at Waterloo was still drilled, but was also more likely to have better officers in charge of troops, although the vast majority would still be posh boys. Interesting fact. In the 17 and 1800s, recruiting sergeants would be employed to recruit men to the army, and one way in which they might do this would be to buy young men drinks in taverns or pubs until they were good and drunk, and then get them all riled up ready to sign up. Now, I'm just imagining the hangover the next day for those poor men, waking up and going, "Oh my head, what happened last night? You signed up to fight in the army." I did what? Oh God. That must have been a hell of a hangover. The Napoleonic Wars were a huge event that we often overlook, but it left Europe in a state of warfare for 22 years, which actually totally dwarfs the First and Second World Wars. And during these 22 years, countries spent massive amounts on the armed forces. When the war ended after Waterloo, the governments called back their armies. So by 1838, the British Army was back down to 98,000 men. Still up from the 40,000 of 1793 before the war, but way smaller than the 250,000 in 1813 at the height of the war. For the rest of the 19th century, army recruitment and training remained very similar. The soldiers were drilled over and over again, the officers were mostly selected from those that could afford a commission, and the lower ranks were made up of men whose life was so desperately poor that they were willing to face a life of harsh discipline, difficult conditions, and the ever-present chance of death or dismemberment. Then, the First World War happened. The First World War was a war that very few people at the time anticipated in terms of the scale of the destruction, the cost in money, and, for our podcast on training and recruitment, the cost in men. By the end of the war, the British Army had in it 4 million men. 4 million. And that's not to take into account the millions that came before and had been killed, injured, taken prisoner, or left for any other reason. The British started the war by trying to encourage people to volunteer with things like the famous "We need you" poster with the pointing finger, or the promise that if pals joined up together, they could serve together in pals battalions, which was an important development. It brought new recruits, did the pals battalions, but it wasn't enough. For the first time, it wasn't enough, so for the first time in British history, the British Army enforced something called conscription from January the 1st, 1916, so that any unmarried men aged 19 to 40 could be called up and forced to fight. By 1918, this was not enough, so it had included married men also. Now, if we're thinking about changes and similarities, they're being forced to fight here, it's not volunteers. Perhaps you could say this is fairly similar to military service. Second World War then, conscription began from the start. And it also extended to women in December 1941, so that women were conscripted to fight. They were conscripted to vital war occupations, which were, of course, incredibly dangerous, and we definitely needed you women to help us to win the war. Conscription to the British Army for British men lasted until 1960, so 15 years after the war ended, men were still having to go and join the army for a little while when they reached 18. Since that time, recruitment has been very similar, just as it is today, with adverts and things. People can choose to join the regular army or the territorial army. The territorial army is a part-time army where soldiers have to commit to a minimum of 27 days per year of military training. And if Britain ever becomes involved in conflict, these territorial soldiers could be sent to help the regular army. But for the rest of the time, they just have normal jobs and live normal lives. The current size of our territorial force is 35,000 men and women. The regular army is around 100,000 men strong, or men and women should I say, with another 75,000 added if you take into account the Navy and the Air Force. So that's 175,000 men in the armed forces with an extra 35,000 to be called up if needed. When a soldier has served in the army, he or she can opt to join the regular reserves as well. So when they've done their bit, they can sort of go, right, okay, well, I'll join the regular reserves, and if I'm needed, I can still be called up later. In 1991, in the Gulf War, the coalition, including the British, sent 750,000 men. There were soldiers from all sorts of different countries in this coalition, and they went to fight 250,000 Iraqis. This is the new nature of warfare. Small-scale wars. It's dwarfed by the numbers. Remember we said in the First World War, by the end there were 4 million men. This was 1 million men on both sides fighting in the Gulf War. Nuclear bombs have made another world war between nations unlikely. So the British aims to have a well-trained, small, high-tech army to deal with threats that could arise anywhere in the world. So over this period things have changed a lot. Let's summarise. Going way back to the start, the Roman army was way ahead of its time in recruitment and training, but the Celtic army was less an army and more of a group of people who decided they should fight at any given time. The Saxon army was one step up from the Celts with well-trained housecarls, but there weren't many of them, and most of the army was still a peasant army that owed military service. The Norman army was one step up further still because it included mercenaries who might have some training in addition to peasants owing military service, but like the housecarls, it would be the knights which were the only well-trained aspects of the Norman army, though they did have cavalry. As the medieval era wore on, assizes of arms were passed to force men to learn to fight, and then to force them, particularly to practice the bow. The new model army was created in the Civil War of the 1600s, and this new model army was well-disciplined, well-trained, and it was a standing army, signalling a new development in the recruitment and training of armies. The armies of the 1700s had rich officers and the dregs of society in the lower ranks, but the armies were drilled relentlessly to fire in ranks and to march in regulation. The French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars changed things a bit. In terms of the lower ranks, being able to gain promotion to non-commissioned roles, and those that paid for a commission had to serve first before taking up their position. But things didn't change that much in recruitment and training. Then the First World War and the unbelievable scale of the fighting led to conscription, which was reintroduced at the beginning of the Second World War, only to be stopped in 1960 before the army recruited much as we would recognise it to be recruited today. This podcast was all about how armies are created, or were created, in terms of their initial recruitment and then how armies turn raw recruits into soldiers. I hope you found it useful. We'll end by showing you some of the past questions that have come up regarding this topic. Read them and see if you can answer them. I've been Mr. Otway. Good night.